Chapter 24. Monday, July 15th through Sunday, July 21st, 1776. The time is now near at hand which must probably determine whether Americans are to be freemen or slaves. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die. Message issued to Continental troops from New York Military Headquarters, July 1776. The spark kindled on my cheek, flared and spread through my entire body, first my eyes, then hair, then down my limbs until even my toes and fingers felt they were aflame. Strange scenes swam before me, first in light, then darkness, then light again. I saw Papa, but no, not truly him, another son of Africa, brow furrowed, his voice deep and strong as a church bell. Mamma hovered over me, but her face faded into a woman I did not know, older than Mamma, with strands of white in her hair. She talked Jamaica, more songs than words, and brought bitter tea to my mouth, and made the world smell of lemons, and told me to sleep. I asked about Ruth over and over, and tried to apologize for letting her get stole, but the words were sawdust in my mouth. Curzon's face floated up in front of me. He told me to shake my lazy bones and get out of bed. He did not turn into a dead person, from when I was little. This was a strange comfort. I blinked, and he was gone again. The room was dark again, with starlight in the windows, and the sounds of a baby crying, and farther away the barking of a lonely dog. Strangest of all was the hive of bees that had taken up residence inside of me. They swarmed under my skin and gave off peculiar vibrations. The buzzing echoed in my brain pan and crowded out my thoughts. The fire in me burned on and on. I woke. I did not know where I was. This was not Rhode Island, or the hold of a ship, or the locked-in cellar, or any other room in their house. It certainly was not the dungeon under City Hall. Was this a dream? Had I passed over to the land of the dead? Did ghosts sleep on clean sheets that smelled of mint? I sat up. The room was warm and quite small, but entirely free of dirt, vermin, and mice. The walls were freshly whitewashed and the floor polished. Lace curtains fluttered in the window. Through it I saw the tops of trees. This was an attic room, then. The bed was softer than anything I had ever lain in, properly made up with linens, 2 pillows, and a coverlet of deep blue. A chair was positioned next to the bed, and a chamber pot, empty, rested under that. I tried to stand, but the room spun around me, and I plopped back down. I was wearing my shift, still stained with blood at the neckline, but my skirt, stockings, and bodice were not to be seen, or my shoes. I closed my eyes tight, then opened them again. Same room, still no shoes. The door opened, and in stepped the funny talking Dutch maid of Lady Seymour. Her eyes flew open wide, then she slammed the door shut and ran away. A moment later the door opened again, and in walked the lady herself. "Ah," she said with faint surprise, "you've come back to us." She poured water from the jug into a mug, handed it to me, and sat on the chair. I drank down a gulp. My lips were dried and cracked. When I swallowed, it caused my burned cheek to ache. My fingers flew up to check the wound. There was a cloth stuck to my face with ointment oozing out from the edges. Lady Seymour leaned forward and gently removed my hand. "Best not to touch it yet," she said. The healer woman put a comfrey salve on it to draw out the pestilence. "Beg pardon, ma'am," I croaked. My voice was raspy with lack of use. "But where am I, and why?" She glanced out the window before she spoke, her mouth set in a grim line. "How best to say this?" she began. I waited, not sure how to answer. "You have lain here, near insensible, for 6 days." 6? Do you remember what happened? The bees threatened to overtake my mind again, their wings beating quickly. I took another drink of water. I remember some. The rest is a jumble, ma'am. You tried to run away and were beaten in the attempt. You passed 2 days under City Hall and emerged gravely ill with fever and heaven knows what else. After your trial you were branded. I was not aware of these events until after they occurred. Your friend with the red hat came to the door with the news that you were near dead in the stocks. After consulting with Anne, I arranged to have you transported here. She looked directly at me. I further questioned Anne and discovered her version of the events. I find the buying and selling of children most repugnant. Your reaction to the news of your sister, while unfortunate, was understandable in my view. Ruth, 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 buzzed the bees. I blinked back tears. Do you know who bought my sister, ma'am? I have so far failed to uncover that fact. She stood up and walked to the window. My nephew's wife is stubborn as well as intemperate. I clutched at the bed covers. I will find her. She pulled the lace curtain aside and studied something passing in the street below. I thought through what she said and found a slim thread of hope to grasp hold of. Begging pardon again, ma'am, but do I work for you now? She let the curtain fall. I am afraid not. Anne insists that you be returned to her household as soon as you are able. The law supports her position. I fear in these unsettled times there is little remedy. A wave of weariness crashed over me at the thought of serving Madam again, of allowing her to see her mark upon my face every day. I expect you'd like to bathe, Lady Seymour said. Angelica is preparing the water for you as we speak. You'll find the rest of your clothes in the kitchen. She paused in the doorway. You miss your parents terribly, don't you? Pardon, ma'am? While you lay in the fever you spoke of them with great affection, as if they were in the room with us. She hesitated for a moment, then picked up her skirts. No matter. I will escort you back to Anne's once you have bathed and eaten. Angelica took the trouble to make the tub full and the water warm and sweet-smelling. I thanked her, and she gave me a little smile. She said something in the Dutch speech which I did not understand. We must have looked two fools, me speaking English, her talking Dutch, both nodding our heads and wishing we had the right words. My clothes had been washed and ironed, my shoes wiped clean of mud and muck. Even better was the meal of fried eggs, toasted bread, and a fruit compote of pears and apples, topped with strawberries and cream. When Angelica set the food in front of me, her eyes went to the fresh scar on my face, rinsed clean of salve and patted dry. She winced at the sight. As I wiped up the last of my egg with the bread, Lady Seymour entered, followed by her cat. She had changed into a peach-colored crinoline gown and was pulling on lace gloves. "It is time," she said. I walked 2 steps behind her, carrying a basket of daisies and a heart filled with dread. When we arrived at the Locktons, she walked up the front steps without ever looking back at me. She paused before she lifted the door-knocker. "Go on," she said. I opened the side gate to the garden, entered, and closed it behind me. I heard the knocker booming under Lady Seymour's hand as I walked slowly to the back door. Part 2, Chapter 25. Sunday, July 21st through Tuesday, August 20th, 1776. Our slaves, sir, cost us money, and we buy them to make money by their labor. If they are sick, they are not only unprofitable, but expensive. Benjamin Franklin, The Gazetteer, and New Daily Advertiser. Melancholy held me hostage, and the bees built a hive of sadness in my soul. Dark honey filled up inside me, drowning my thoughts and making it hard to move my eyes and hands. I worked as a puppet, trained to scrub and carry, curtsy and nod. Madam would not look at me. When she had an order to give, it went through Becky, even if we all stood in the same room. "Tell the girl the hearth needs sweeping." "Sal," Becky would say, "please sweep the hearth." "Tell the girl to fetch my fan." "Sal," Becky would say, "please fetch Madam's ivory fan." "The library needs dusting. Tell the girl." "Sal." I swept the hearth and fetched the fan. I dusted the library without looking at the books on the shelves or the horse on the wall. I preferred the chores that took me out of the kitchen. For it was there the bees tricked me into seeing Ruth's ghost playing on the floor, churning butter or counting out kernels of corn. When her voice whispered to me, I caught fire again from my toes to my face, and I burned slow like damp wood. Becky watched me careful when I turned inside myself like that. She once tried to apologize for what happened. The instant she stopped talking, I forgot what she said. Tell the girl there are bedbugs in my chamber. Tell the girl to wash the steps. Curzon came around day after day and talked to me through the boards of the fence. I did not answer him. July marched out and August sailed in on a suffocating tide. British ships continued to land at Staten Island, hundreds of them carrying thousands of soldiers armed with countless guns and bullets. We went 2 weeks without rain. There were outbreaks of camp fever, smallpox, and dysentery amongst the rebel troops. They turned King's College into a hospital to care for thousands of sick men. I prayed that Colonel Regan was there. I prayed he would fall ill and die a terrible death for lying to me and betraying me and letting them break my body. Whenever I heard the words liberty or freedom, I wanted to spit in the dust. The air was steeped in evil during those muggy, pestilent days. Tell the girl to sweep the cellar. When I swept it, I found the cobwebs I had saved for Ruth. I threw them into the kitchen fire, along with the mouse carcasses and rotted potatoes. Tell the girl the milk was soured. 'Twas left in the sun on purpose. The British finally made a move toward the end of August, rowing half their army across to the Long Island in flat-bottomed boats. Becky convinced Madam to send me to market on my own again because she was afraid to go. What would the battle do to break out any minute? Madam agreed. She said my mark would ensure I stayed out of trouble. As commanded, I purchased 2 packets of straight pins, a piece of lace, and a basket of turnip greens. The shopkeepers and other folks looked at my face and saw only the angry red scar, just starting to fade at the edges. They did not see the girl hidden behind it. Curzon approached me on Pearl Street and tried to talk. I walked away from him and carried the purchases back to Madam's house, wings abuzz in my ears. Hours later, as I ate my dinner of greens and cornbread with molasses, Becky entered the kitchen with a scowl. "That Curzon boy, the one with the hat, he's in front of the house again," she said. "You must tell him to leave." I lifted my eyes from my plate. "Why?" "Because Madam wants him arrested, and I don't want trouble, that's why," Becky snapped. I did not move. "Do you want his beating on your conscience?" she continued. I chewed the last of the cornbread, then wiped my fingers and stood up. "Tell him to stay away," she said as I set my plate in the washing-up tub. "Blasted fool doesn't know what's good for him." When I lifted the latch of the garden gate, Curzon appeared, mouth a-flappin'. "Finally! We've much to talk about." "Go away," I said. He glanced up and down the empty street. "Look, I'm sorry. The Colonel, I thought sure he would help." He stopped and leaned close to my face. "You don't look right. Camp fever?" My tongue felt the ragged edge of a broken tooth. "I'm fine." He dropped his eyes to the ground. "Sorry's not enough, but I am sorry about all of it." I picked at a splinter of wood on the gate. There was something changed about him, but I could not figure it. Many things look different since they burned me up. "Not your concern," I said. "'Tis so," he said. "I've asked about your sister. A sailor I know thinks she was put on a ship to Halifax." "No, they sent her to Nevis." He opened his mouth but could not find any words. "Go away," I said, "or they'll arrest you," Madam said. "Has she received any letters from Lockton?" The question hit me like a bucket of cold water. "You asking me to spy again?" "Listen," he said. "Our freedom—" I did not let him continue. "You are blind. They don't want us free. They just want liberty for themselves." "You don't understand." "Oh, no, I understand right good," I countered. "I shouldn't have believed your rebel lies. I should have taken Ruth and run the night we landed. Even if we drowned, we would have been together." He reached out and grabbed my arm. "Don't say that." His hand was strong, but so was mine. I grabbed his thumb and twisted it backward. "Turn me loose." My body and voice shook as if trapped in one of Ruth's fits. "Sorry." He released me, and I released him. "I'm sorry for your sister and your face and your broken head." He wiggled his thumb. "100 times as sorry as the hills." I moved to shut the gate in his face. He held it open. "We all have scars, Isabel." "I'll never talk to you again." I threw myself against the gate, shut it, and threw home the latch. Chapter 26. Wednesday, August 21st to Sunday, August 25th, 1776. We have our coach standing before our door every night, and the horses are harnessed ready to make our escape, if we have time. Poor New York! I long to have the battle over, and yet I dread the consequences. Letter written by Mary, daughter of Patriot Brigadier General John Warren Scott, as her family prepared to flee New York. The storm that hit the city the next night was the worst I had ever seen. A thundercloud big as a mountain swept up the river just before sunset. Lightning danced at its edges like horses at a mad gallop. Then the sky turned ink black and the storm crashed over us. The wind blew signs off buildings, overturned soldiers' tents, and stripped the clean clothes that had been pegged out to dry. Thunder boomed like 1,000 cannons. A house 3 blocks over was struck by a lightning bolt and burned to the ground. 13 soldiers were killed by lightning, too. The coins in their pockets melted and their flesh roasted. One lightning-struck soldier survived but was turned deaf, blind, and unable to speak. We were forced to concern ourselves with more domestic matters. The window frames in the front parlor leaked terrible during the storm. Rain soaked the drapes and rugs and left the wall plaster soft and spongy. "Tell the girl to clean up this mess." Becky asked around for days, but there were no spare carpenters to be found. No matter how much coin was offered, the men were all getting ready for war. The British had set up a new camp in Brooklyn on Long Island, and Washington was moving his troops around like pieces on a checkerboard. He sent most of his men across to face the British and others north to defend Fort Washington and Harlem. The front windows continued to leak. Becky began to talk of leaving for her uncle's house in Jersey. I pretended to listen to her. The streets were filled with the hurry-scurry of a moving army splashing through mud puddles. Madame called for tea. I left to fetch fresh water. A few bees flew out of my head as I walked north with my buckets, blown out by the strong east wind. The pain helped, too. I had cut the palm of my left hand on a dull blade at breakfast. Becky wrapped it for me, but it stung to carry even an empty bucket. Nassau Street was fair deserted all the way up to the Commons. Most folks had fled, afeared to be caught between 2 angry armies. That's why I was surprised to see a crowd at the water pump. A dozen or so men and boys, slaves who had been hired by the army to build barricades, and a few women fetching water like me. Beyond the men I could see the pile of paving stones that had been pulled up for the barricade. It was midday and the folks were gathered for a cool drink, a bite to eat, and some conversating. The talk stopped as I approached. All eyes went to my face. I had not been to the pump since my branding. I gripped the buckets tight, holding in the pain. Most in the crowd were strangers to me. "Mercy," muttered one woman, as she studied my scar. "Pain you much?" asked another, her hair wrapped in a worn yellow cloth. "It tugs some, ma'am," I said, "not as much as it did." One man spat over his shoulder and said something in a language I did not understand. The other men turned their eyes from me back to grandfather, the old man who sat by the pump, and went back to their argument. I was grateful to have the attention leave me. "You're not looking at the facts," a bald man said to grandfather. "The British Lord Dunmore in Virginia offered freedom, total freedom, to any slave who escapes to his camp. He shook his fist in the air when he said freedom. Thousands have run away and joined up already." Grandfather simply nodded his head, with more behind them, I expect. A second man, this one with neatly trimmed hair, leaned on his shovel. "Dunmore freed the Virginia slaves so the crops would go unharvested and ruin the planters. The British care not for us. They care only for victory. Some patriots own slaves, yes, but you must listen to their words. All men created equal. The words come first. They'll pull the deeds and the justice behind them." "You're a fool," the bald man said. He motioned to the piles of paving stones and the logs waiting to be dragged into position. "We should sabotage the barricades. If the British win, we'll all be free." several people scolded. I blinked. The bees in my head fell silent and hugged their wings tight to their bodies. The British would free us? All of us? The men fell to arguing with each other, the women chiming in occasionally. Finally the bald man raised his hands. One of us here was privy to the rebel plans, worked with one of the bosses there. Tell us, Curzon boy, what do you think of the rebel lies? At the sound of his name, Curzon stepped forward from the side of the building where he had been sitting in the shade. He looked even more changed than he had the week before. What was different? What say you? Grandfather asked. I say I'm an American, Curzon said, an American soldier. It was his clothes. When I first met him, he was dressed like the house servant of a wealthy man, which he was. Now the tailored waistcoat was gone, and his shirt was dirty with sweat and mud. It hung over a pair of working man's breeches that were cut off below his knee. He did not have on stockings or shoes. Even his fancy red hat was flecked with mud. The wind caught at my skirts and swirled them around my ankles. Did he say soldier? The first man laughed. You are an American slave. He untied the cloth around his neck and rinsed it in the pump water before adding in a lower voice, as are we all. Curzon shook his head. He was still stubborn as ever, if a bit worn. Not me, not for long. Master Bellingham promised me freedom for enlisting in his place. And you believe him? The man laughed louder. He's feeding you to the cannon so he can be safe. If you don't die, he'll stick your neck under his boot again. Lower your voices. Grandfather held up a shaky hand and motioned to me. Come, child, get your water. I walked to him and set my buckets on the ground. The woman in the yellow headcloth worked the pump for Grandfather. The British promise freedom to slaves, but won't give it to the white rebels, she said as she pushed the handle up and down. The rebels want to take freedom, but they won't share it with us. She set down the first bucket and picked up the second. Both sides say one thing and do the other. The British act on their promises, insisted the bald man. No. The man with the shovel drove it into the ground with frustration. They lie. When the British fled Boston back in the spring, they took escaping slaves with them. They promised them freedom. He stretched out the word until it sounded ugly. Where are those slaves now? No one answered him. I'll tell you, he continued. Forced into the Louisbourg coal mines in Canada. They work and die under the ground. They never see the sun, and they'll never taste your freedom. We stood in silence as the pump handle creaked. At last, Grandfather chuckled. This is not funny, old man, said the fellow with the shovel. Young people are always funny, he said. Funny and foolish. The woman in the yellow headcloth finished filling the second bucket. What do you mean, Grandfather? This is not our fight, the old man said. British or American, that is not the choice. You must choose your own side. Find your road through the valley of darkness that will lead you to the river Jordan. We don't have the river Jordan here, Grandfather, the bald man said as he retied the wet cloth around his neck. We have the East River, with currents fast enough to kill a man, and the North River 2 miles wide. Both are mighty hard to cross. Grandfather chuckled again. You don't understand. Everything that stands between you and freedom is the river Jordan. Come closer, child. This last he said to me. I stepped in front of him and reached for my buckets, but he took my hands in his. I stopped, unsure what to do next. Look at me, he said. I bent down a little, bringing my face level with his. He tilted my chin to the side so he could examine the brand on my cheek. I tried to pull away, but he held fast. A scar is a sign of strength, he said quietly, the sign of a survivor. He leaned forward and lightly kissed my cheek, right on the branding mark. His lips felt like a tired butterfly that landed once, then fluttered away. I stepped back and touched the cheek. The men were returning to the barricades. Other servants had formed a line for the pump. Grandfather winked and handed me the buckets. Look hard for your river Jordan, my child. You'll find it. Carrying those full buckets back to the Locktons was powerful hard. The cut on my left hand pained me too much to use it, and my right hand was not big enough, my arm not strong enough to carry 2 buckets at once. I journeyed in a crow-hop fashion, carrying one bucket for 20 strides, setting it down, then returning to fetch the second bucket, and carrying it forward to meet its partner. I made slow progress in this manner for 2 blocks when Curzon joined me. He would not look at me, didn't say a word neither. He simply carried the buckets to the Lockton's gate for me, then walked away.